So Jarvis, you are at LA, and especially with taxi, and I heard some of the things you described yesterday at the OMF board meeting. You're doing a lot of very innovative things, and I'm going to put it in the category of we've spent a lot of time over the last few years talking about data and tools to allow us to see what is going on, to visualize what's going on, but you've always been about, I want to change what I see. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about regulation, your role, and what's going on with taxi?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for coming to our talk today. And I appreciate that question, Hugh, because one of the things we look at is we're trying to develop data-driven solutions, in terms of how we do things. And so one of the things that you saw in a taxi cab environment is that it's a legacy program, 100-year-old regulations across the board, across the country. And they were very difficult to change. There was no dynamism to taxis in that way. And even when you wanted to create a solution, you could create a solution, but then that solution stays in place for years. You're doing this 5-year research project, then you finally get an answer, and then you set together a plan and a program, and then it's in the rule book for the next 30 years, and no one's revisited. No one's taken a look back. No one said, oh, that worked for these 3 years, but something has changed. And so now, the way that I see the future of regulation is, I can make a rule, but it's something that we can tweak, move levers, and I think part of that is kind of through like a digital infrastructure space. Because being able to set a rule and then being able to say, this works or that doesn't work, because I have to balance cost, scalability, profitability for my companies. So I work with the private sector, and it's a very big deal that I have to find a way to ensure that they can make money. But on top of that, I want them to be able to make that money while still following the principles of what I need as a city, regards to safety and regards to equity. And so now, instead of making some equity plan that worked years ago that no one can really test or verify or even truly audit, I can now make a plan that I can test, verify, and audit, and then determine, is it working? Set real metrics, set real KPIs about how do we want to really do this, and is this going to be something that's great for the future?
Yep. Awesome. So a critical component of what we get with a real digital infrastructure. Carlos, I know that in advance that you think a lot like LA does. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about this and what, as we think about multimodal and bigger view of infrastructure, what comes to mind?
Certainly. You guys heard the radio voice here, right? It's phenomenal, right? It's captivating. So the first, let me tell you, I think that this is why we believe in open source, right? Following the lead from Connie, from Jarvis and the team, and the work they've done over the last couple of years, we are going to be in an advantage moving forward, right? So the fact that we can actually leverage your effort for the last couple of years and hit the ground running moving forward, it is a great opportunity. So thank you very much. And at some point, I hope to even return the favor to you or even pay forward. And I think that's what the OMH stands for, right? So bring that community, that village that you mentioned. So we're a Department of Transportation and Public Works is often basically a long name, doesn't do justice. I like to consider ourselves a mobility management agency. We're fully responsible for moving people around in Miami-Dade County, whether it's on streets, or on transit, or any other forms of transportation, taxis, limos, and others. So the way I see it is, for many years, we've been managing the demand in public right-of-way in time and space. Green light, red light, park here, don't park there, and delivering that message through static signs and relying on the human behavior, on understanding and make their own perception of what that meant, right? Yep. Now, with digital-enabled mobility solutions, which is, again, some of the things that we see here in CoMotion, we now have the opportunity for the first time, I see it, to manage the demand in public right-of-way in time, space, and mode. Fully bringing together an incorporated mobility ecosystem that can leverage all moving parts of our economy. But at the same time, now with digital infrastructure, and I think you cover very well, I can see if our intended uh, solution is actually coming to fruition and it's actually meeting the expectation that we had by looking at the behavior, by understanding how things work, by auditing that component, we can now quickly, and I think you mentioned about data, and I agree, I could care less for data, but I do care about insights and information, right? This is me what I actually look into, and data facilitate that, and the fact that now for the first time in so many years, we have quickly information in real time, the insights that can help us do more and a better management public right away and understanding the, the impacts that some of these mobility solutions have. It's outstanding and really as facilitating for us to better manage the space, ultimately benefiting the community as a whole.
Yep, yep. Kristen, your building is right across the street from USDOT. So you are our authority on what USDOT is thinking and this whole idea of digital infrastructure.
We're in trouble, Hugh.
Just try. Just try. What do you think?
Well, first, I really want to thank John and CoMotion for convening us. I think it's really incredible that we get to have this space. So thank you, and for Hugh for introducing us in this conversation. And before I actually answer that, as a lawyer, I'm going to pivot for a sec and ask for a quick poll. Who goes home and actually talks to their friends and family using the word infrastructure? Oh, okay. Well, okay, we got some aficionados. Okay, who in the last week, every single day, tracked when you left your city, your county, or beyond your state? That's interesting to me. So the United States Department of Transportation was actually a partner of ours. 31 years ago, ITS America was founded to advise them on those topics. How do you develop an interoperable system? What does infrastructure, what does the way we move look like with new data, with the internet, with the smartphone? Because they didn't know how to do it. They didn't have technologists. They didn't have you all learning about technology and innovation. And so we were founded as the nation's largest public-private nonprofit. We have companies from the largest multinational companies to tech companies like Lacuna to cities and state DOTs coming together to ask, how do we develop this interoperable system? And it keeps coming back to this topic of digital infrastructure, despite us not knowing how to define infrastructure. So a year ago, we met with the USDOT and we said, oh my gosh, congratulations, you're investing $1 trillion into our system. How much of that is going into digital transformation? And you saw the stats already on the screen. I don't have to belabor that. But when we asked with these officials what programs they were developing, how they were thinking about it, they said, but infrastructure, isn't that like the street and the bridge, signal? And we said, no, it is these insights that the LAs, the Miamis, many of you are already thinking about how we integrate an interoperable system that helps us move. So we knew that we had a lot of work to do. And this week we celebrate the first anniversary of the IIJA. So it's a little infant now, almost a toddler. And what we have achieved are a few things. Through ITS America's leadership with many of you here as either members or partners, we have created this campaign to talk about what we are actually doing every day, right? We might be using a little bit different language, but we are now challenging the USDOT, which is doing several things. First, it has this non-traditional emerging transportation technology, a NET council, because they love acronyms that, again, make no sense. And they are solely focused on what does digital infrastructure look like for the department across modes, from air to space to even PHMSA, which is, in fact, a modal administration. Look it up, and it's very important. Two, ITS America is working with partners across the country to create the digital infrastructure framework of the future. So in the next 6 months of 2023, we're going to have something similar to what Hugh showed. Maybe it's not 7 layers, maybe it's something similar, but we want your input to understand what that ITS of the future, what that digital infrastructure 2.0 is actually going to look like. And third, Congress has authorized them $2 billion for these moonshot innovations. I love that you use that term, Hugh, because Congress understands that it shouldn't be up to the VCs of the world to invest in technology and innovation. We should be doing it as a global competitive leader in innovation and transportation. And so ARPA-I, some of you might remember that, 20 years ago, DARPA created the autonomous vehicle. DARPA created GPS. And so the Transportation Department, the USDOT, has its own ARPA, which is now looking at how do we invest in some of these solutions that it might be really hard for someone that's not in LA or Miami of the world. I came from Minneapolis. We had a lot of financial challenges. We didn't have money to do this amazing work they did, but maybe the USDOT can help us. And so we at ITS America are challenging them to do this work and having conversations like this where we'll hear from them tomorrow.
Awesome. Peter, you are old enough, as am I, to remember the disparate world of IBM doesn't talk to HP, doesn't talk to DEC. How did that all happen, and what lessons can we learn from that as we think about developing an infrastructure stack for transportation?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the OSI model, right? So the open systems interconnection idea was a conceptual model with conceptual layers that didn't survive the protocol wars of the 80s and early 90s. Right, at the time, there was this mad heterogeneous mix of a lot of people trying to do useful things, but at the boundary of whatever they were doing, there was this disconnect between one representation in one platform and the representation in the others. So mercifully, something that the DoD and ARPA invented came in with a 4-layer stack that ran the table, and then Tim Berners-Lee put HTTP on top of it, and we have the internet, right? And it's unlocked all of these applications and services which are permissionless, where I can just go and operate my website or my company on top of that government-derived protocol. We actually live in a world today which is very much like the protocol wars for transportation, right? That we see the need, we see the applications, and we have this wildly variant environments that things like the OMF are making some inroads into. But it isn't just about communications protocols anymore. It's about the ontologies of what we want to express in terms of sustainability and equity, and candidly for cities, how do they make revenue out of my infrastructure? And all of those things are necessary inputs to have a system which something that an innovation in New York translates to an innovation in Los Angeles, that a series of inputs on equity and safety can be represented in a way that I can feed into a machine learning model, right? We don't have these common nouns and verbs that we can feed these training sets with, and they're reasonably easy to codify, and it's reasonably easy to imagine a world where fairly quickly, driven by both public and private interests that seek to be orchestrated together, otherwise both of them will fail. I think it's a relatively short path to getting those common representations to be used and to be useful in this in a broader context. And I thoroughly agree that TCP is a global standard, right? Everybody operates the same way. Showing leadership in that space puts the US in a position to drive some of these. And I think many of the people in the room will have a significant influence over making that happen.
Great. As a CEO of a venture-backed startup, I can tell you what it's like to raise money to sell to cities. It's not always a fun activity. So if we had something like we've described, does that change the equation in terms of your interest in investing?
Well, as an investor in a venture-backed smart cities startup, I agree. Look, I think all of these things are absolutely necessary for scale, right? That there are applications and services that support both public and private interests, which are impossible to invest in if you can't deploy it over a large swath of infrastructure. If you have to start from first principles in every city, it's just not viable. But like all other platforms who have normalized, once you do have a platform to be able to have applications that serve broad audiences in broad geographies, then you can write a check, and then you can unlock a whole bunch of private capital to pursue that innovation.
Got it. I haven't solicited this question from the audience, but Andrew, I see you. I talked a little bit earlier about how do we get cities and states to work together, because this is not going to be a city-led initiative, nor is it going to be a state-led initiative. Your job is so far to represent the interests of cities, and I know you're thinking really hard about digital infrastructure. Do you have an opinion about how we can bridge the gap between cities and states? Do we have a microphone for him?
It's a great question, Hugh, and keep in mind, my board of directors are all city transportation executives, so I don't want to get
County too.
sorry. Use like this yeah. The city term is an inclusive one. Let's put it that way. Inclusive of the Miami-Dade County, MPOs that are part of the organization, and a natural extension of that is finding the connections to work more closely with states. You hit on an important point, though. When I put my Seattle DOT hat back on, I immediately get shivers when I think about partnering with WSDOT in the state of Washington. They're different animals, and sometimes animals when the resources are perceived to be scarce, can fight unnecessarily or create turf battles unnecessarily. And so I think a lot of this is about not trying to redistribute the existing sort of pie of revenue or opportunity, but actually growing that pie and perhaps redefining that pie so that it's not a zero-sum game and you get out of the same traditional turf wars. Because in order for digital infrastructure to really take root, especially at a local level, the resources need to come from the federal government. And that means that states and cities need to find a way to work together so that the resources can flow to the states to enable them to do what they need to do, and also flow to the cities to enable more activity at that level so there can be deeper collaboration between the two.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily an answer, but I mean there's a path there.
Yep.
And
No, I see
the
it.
first step is just creating the forums, and I think Kristen, ITSA is a great forum to be able to actually have those transparent conversations about ways to work together.
If I may, Hugh, I don't think there's anyone in this room, and I would love to talk to you after happy hour or with the whiskey that someone has, who actually believes we can develop these solutions in silos, right? And so you do need your community, right? You need a community to just talk to your city folks, right? And I had that when I was back in the day. Even when I was at a state DOT, I led Minnesota's innovation program. I needed to chat with other states because we do have different challenges. MPOs have challenges. Tech companies have their own cohorts. But we are all part of this enormous ecosystem. And we need to come together in venues like this, through CoMotion and others, so that we can actually come together to develop these solutions, not just in public sector, not just in private sector, not just as a city, not just as a small tech company, but that is how we're going to challenge our federal government to take real leadership and fund us all so we can do what we all want to do. And it's not about the digital infrastructure, it's about the outcomes that Jarvis and Carlos has seen firsthand. Jarvis, I don't want to talk for you, but if you want to share maybe a little bit about some of the equity learnings you're talking and seeing in your work, I would love to hear for them to know.
Wait a minute, Kristen, this is my panel.
You lost it.
But that was a great question.
It is a great question, and actually, I wanted to kind of piggyback on what we were just previously discussing. I do think that there does need to be more connection amongst the cities, because as much as we're different, in a lot of ways, we're all the same. And in many ways, we're all facing the same challenges. We're looking at, oftentimes, at the same equity principles. And so a lot of what I think we often try to do, and especially on the regulatory side, when I speak with other cities, we're trying to get away from this idea that it's so different, because it's really not. And I think part of the digital infrastructure piece, to me, is establishing kind of a standard that we can all take as cities, and then we can all pull levers and tweak based upon our own kind of locales. But ultimately, the issue for us is just, it's the same things, it's the same problems. The taxi issues in New York are similar to the taxi issues here, same in Philly. Dockless issues are the same across the board. And so, but what we don't have is this unified way of looking at it.
Yep.
This unified way of looking at that data. And then same in terms of getting the state and the feds involved. When I do, one of the things you mentioned in your talk, Hugh, was the ability to get federal dollars. I honestly believe that if we can put together programs that are really data-driven and with kind of similar standardization across the board, we can start pointing, surgically to our problems and going to the feds and saying, hey, we've been able to figure out that we have this thing and we also now have this need. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because I don't know how you get the feds involved before that, but I do want to say that I think once we can get the digital infrastructure pieces in place, we'll be able to start going to them and saying, I have a proof of concept, I have an idea that here's what we're going to need, and here are the resources we need, and you're going to help, we would like you to help, but not what you're going to do. I'm not going to tell them what to do. I would like you to help us get to that space. Do we need to subsidize this mode? Do we need to do these other things for these modes? Do we need different equipment for this mode? These are the things that I think are going to be really helpful in the long term.
And if I may, so this is exactly the conversation we to have, right? And the conversation that we start seeing now is we are saying, okay, we now have the digital infrastructure, we have the capacity to actually manage more efficiently the public right of way. And we need to start talking about the outcomes and the expected outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And you see a historical change in our administration at the federal level and coming down, where now we're looking at the benefit of mobility from a different point of view, not just about being fast and basically provide a rail line here and there. It's more about what are we actually delivering for our communities, right? And I think that's, to me, the common ground that we're going to bring people together. And the one thing I also want to talk about is the last thing that I would like for us to do is to digitize our current approach to things, right? So just because we have a static digital physical infrastructure, science, or management, to basically do a static digital infrastructure. And I think that's the difference between infrastructure and policy. And to me, this is what we need to start establishing more. One, we talk about digital infrastructure. What are the digital policies that are going to be enabling through that infrastructure? And use that in a more dynamic way that meets the context of the neighborhood. You know, these streets can be 30 miles an hour during nighttime, but right now when people are crossing the street, could it be 10 miles an hour? We don't do that today because of static infrastructure, but digital can actually enable that. So this is a perfect example for us. And I believe, like, by just talking about what is the outcomes, economic vitality, safety, environmental responsibility, all those things that everyone talk about, that's the common denominator here. The rest should become easier.
Totally agree. Great, we've got a few minutes left. Are there some questions? All right.
People are asking why the bottle.
Do we have a question? Irina.
Good afternoon. This question is for Carlos and Jarvis. So as you both run your respective departments, functions, and initiatives, what is one most important thing that keeps you up at night when it comes to digital infrastructure? I know there are many, so I'm just was hoping to hear the one on top of the list.
You know, I think there is something that keeps me up at night. It's, you know, are we going to be able to keep up with what we're doing? And, you know, as we talk to other cities, and I think this is true even in states, we don't even have the manpower infrastructure to do a lot of what we need to do. And so we're actually trying to look, and we've come to realize, wow, we need these other type of human capital resources to really help manage these programs, because as these programs get more sophisticated, our clients, our partners, our providers are getting more sophisticated. And I think the big fear that I have is, even though here in LA we've started MDS, I look at it like, oh, we need to mature it now, because now I feel like that's in the past. Like, now we really need to start doing the upper layers of that, and it's no longer just this bottom layer thing. There's so much more that needs to be done. But in a positive way, does bring out, hey, there's so much more we can actually do, and then you want to start working on that. So, Carlos.
I don't know how I can follow that. It's just, you know, to me, it is exactly the point, right? So right now, things are changing, right? And even if we went from intelligent transportation system to a smart city initiative and things like that, we start seeing a migration from, you know, basic engineering to now more digital environment, right? And right now, I think that manpower kind of challenge is across the board. And for us, it is, again, that starting point and scale up. Because it is not only about scooters. It's not about scooters. It's more about everything that moves in public right of way and how we can actually do effectively what we've been doing for decades, but now for a different approach. So again, I think the beauty is we're not alone. We have great leaders like City of Los Angeles, and we have many other cities across the world really tackling this together. And I think that's what it's put me back to sleep after I get concerned, right?
Thank you.
Okay, 30 seconds. Kristen, what do you want people to come away with from this panel?
It takes a village. Let's actually actively act together and stop talking about it and do this work. Join us next year.
So common data representations that people agree to is the only path to orchestrating private and public interests for making cities operable and meeting the equity, sustainability, revenue, and other needs of people that live in those cities.
Terrific. Carlos?
Phenomenal. So to me, is let's dream beyond the moon, right? I think we've done a lot of great things already achieved. What we again have established a path forward towards the integrated infrastructure. So was how we can actually change the way we move around. Yeah, I think definitely looking forward to the next 6 months of the conversation here. And I'll be remiss if I don't mention that all this is happening again in Miami, guys. So let's keep out.
And Jarvis?
Similar, Kristen, it does take a village. I think we all have to talk to each other a lot more because ultimately, and again, on the regulatory side, we're making rules and regulations. And if there's one thing that taxi cab regulation has taught us is that, this balkanization of rules is a terrible idea. And so if I have a rule, I shouldn't have to have an entirely different rule in Santa Monica. And again, I think standardization of this digital infrastructure are the kind of things that are going to help us in the future. So we should be talking to each other.